On Friday, June 22, 2018, the White House press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, was asked to leave a restaurant by the owner in protest of the Trump administration. And this event started a debate throughout the media regarding American political civility.
Ever since a Virginia chicken restaurant asked her to leave this weekend, the big debate in America has been, do government officials have the right to be left alone when they're off the clock?
The argument made by many was that government officials being protested outside of the government is uncivil.
We need to stop all this and begin to behave in a civilized manner.
If we can't agree to disagree and let each other be, and neither side wants to do that, it becomes a problem.
There are certain lines, I think, that even in this breakdown of civility we've had in politics that people realize you shouldn't cross.
Are you allowed to just kick someone out because you don't agree with their policies or their beliefs? Whatever happened to tolerance?
Whatever happened to tolerance? Tolerance got grabbed by the pussy, didn't you hear? You didn't hear?
But on the June 26th episode of The Daily Show, Trevor Noah expressed disagreement with this argument. As evidenced by the title of this particular segment, Trevor Noah eviscerates the civility argument. Since Mr. Noah is challenging this so-called civility argument, and since he never argues that the protest in question was civil, it's fair then to assume, for all intents and purposes, that his argument is that protests need not be civil. And obviously, before an argument can even be disemboweled, it first needs to be addressed on its merits. It must be framed correctly. Unfortunately, Mr. Noah repeatedly frames the argument at hand incorrectly. Here's an example of that happening.
Basically, people in power would like to be insulated from the effects of their actions.
This is not the argument that Noah intends to counter. This is the argument that Noah intends to counter. The argument that government officials should not be protested at all is an argument that hasn't been made. This particular government official is the White House press secretary. If the White House press secretary wanted to be insulated, why on earth would she be the White House press secretary? What Mr. Noah has done by framing the argument incorrectly is standing up a straw man. This is a popular logical fallacy. The idea is to refute an argument that was not presented while giving the impression that you're refuting the argument that was presented. Government officials are not arguing that they should never be protested, never, ever, ever. By claiming that they are, Mr. Noah props up a straw man.
People in power would like to be insulated from the effects of their actions.
Once the straw man is propped up, he promptly knocks it down.
But if you're in a position where you can influence other people's lives, you shouldn't be shocked when you hear from the people whose lives you affect. As a government official, people protesting your policies is part of the job.
Naturally, that's a pretty good counter-argument. The only catch is that he didn't counter the actual civility argument. Here's a second example of Mr. Noah standing up a straw man.
It's funny how these people are saying administration officials shouldn't be protested during their off hours, as if the administration's policies only work from 9 to 5. As if the administration's policies only work from 9 to 5. Yeah?
No. Once again, nobody has ever argued that the current administration's policies are undone every day at 5:01 p.m. The argument is that protesting government officials outside of the government is not civil. Mr. Noah does not have to agree with that argument, but he does have to demonstrate that he at least understands that argument if he's going to eviscerate it. So far, he has not confronted the actual argument. He's just knocking over straw men.
It's not like when the White House staff goes home every night, all of a sudden everyone in America is like, woohoo, I have health care back until 9 a.m. tomorrow. Yeah!
One of Mr. Noah's attempts to challenge the civility argument wasn't even an argument. Listen closely. By the tone of his voice, it's going to sound like an argument, but in substance, it's not an argument.
And also, let's not get it twisted. That restaurant owner didn't ask Sarah Huckabee Sanders to leave because of her opinions, okay? She's a senior official of the Trump administration, not some rando with a blog. This person was protesting the government. Sarah Huckabee Sanders just happened to be a part of the government who showed up in her restaurant.
To appreciate why this was not an argument, let's consider an unrelated example. Imagine there being a debate over whether or not the Second Amendment of the Bill of Rights grants U.S. citizens the right to own semi-automatic rifles. And while both sides make their arguments, one side gives their reasons as to why the Second Amendment applies to this weapon, and the other side gives their reasons as to why the Second Amendment does not apply to this weapon, somebody simply states, "Hey, we do have a Second Amendment, you know." Well, thank you, Captain Obvious. We know the debate is about whether or not the Second Amendment protects the use of this particular weapon. Simply stating that the amendment exists does not contribute anything to the debate. In this case, the debate is about whether or not it is justified to protest a government official during their personal time. And you could argue either way. You could give your reasons as to why it is justified, or you could give your reasons as to why it is not justified. But when Trevor Noah simply states that that's what happened, well, duh. We know that already. That's what we're debating.
Let's not get it twisted. That restaurant owner didn't ask Sarah Huckabee Sanders to leave because of her opinions, okay? She's a senior official of the Trump administration, not some rando with a blog. This person was protesting the government. Sarah Huckabee Sanders just happened to be a part of the government who showed up in her restaurant.
In light of the fact that this segment began with multiple strawman fallacies, preceded by a non-argument, it's not inexplicable to find out that the next thing that occurs in this segment is another logical fallacy. Not a strawman this time, but a red herring.
Calls for civility. When people are like, you gotta be more civil, you gotta be more civil. It always tends to come from people in a position of privilege.
A red herring, as a fallacy, is the introduction of a topic during an argument that diverts attention away from the original issue. The issue at hand is the civility, or lack thereof, of protesting government officials during their personal time. Some people have argued that such protests are not civil, but who exactly is making this argument is irrelevant. Even if those who tend to make this argument are privileged, that fun fact does not undermine the argument itself.
You know what really gets me? Is in this whole argument when people say, but Trevor, why can't we be polite? Why not fight hate with love? Why can't these protesters be more like Martin Luther King? He was civil. That's why he named it the civil rights. But what you forget is back when Martin was marching, people were complaining about him the same way these people are complaining about protesters right now.
People in Georgia are sick and tired of Martin Luther King. Wherever he's been, he's attempted to stir up strife, and disorder, and violence.
The best thing for King to do is to get out of Alabama as quickly as he can, because he's a menace to the peace of this city.
Martin Luther King and his coterie of troublemakers who jump about the South like so many fleas on a hot griddle and cause racial rashes where none have heretofore existed.
There are two things that need to be stated about this. The first is that a comparison has just been drawn between those who don't want people to be thrown out of a restaurant and those who did want people to be thrown out of their home state. According to Noah, these two complaints are one and the same, albeit both lament a lack of civility, but the argument being made in the 2010s only relates to certain types of protests of certain types of people at certain times and places in the name of harmony. The argument being made in the 1960s was that protesters ought to be exiled in the name of segregation. These positions are patently different. Regarding them as being the same is a false equivalence. The second thing worth stating is that the takeaway from this, whatever that's supposed to be, is not quite clear. What exactly are we supposed to conclude from this? Because civil rights protesters in the 60s were unfairly referred to as troublemakers, therefore, why bother being civil today? Or maybe the implication is because Dr. Martin Luther King was unpopular before he became popular, therefore kicking government officials out of restaurants will someday become popular as well? Who knows? It is simply not clear where Noah was going with this. And even if it was clear, it still doesn't serve as a counterargument, let alone an evisceration of an argument.
And every day we see people on the news and social media saying, why can't these protesters be more like Martin Luther King? He was civil. That's why he named it the civil rights. But what you forget is back when Martin was marching, people were complaining about him the same way these people are complaining about protesters right now.
We need to stop all this and begin to behave in a civilized manner.
If we can't agree to disagree and let each other be, and neither side wants to do that, it becomes a problem.
There are certain lines, I think, that even in this breakdown of civility we've had in politics that people realize you shouldn't cross.